crime documentary presents the chilling story of a man whose name became synonymous with horror, fear, and betrayal in Belgium. A man who lived among ordinary people, but hid the darkest of secrets beneath the surface of his home. This is not just a crime story, it is a nightmare that shook an entire nation. A reminder that evil can wear the face of an ordinary man. Tonight, we take you inside the twisted world of Marc Dutroux, a predator who built underground chambers of terror and turned innocence into unspeakable suffering. This is the Monster of Belgium, Marc Dutroux' underground horror. It began with whispers that turned into cries of desperation across quiet towns and crowded streets of Belgium as young girls began to vanish without explanation, their lives stolen in a way that left families shattered and authorities fumbling for answers. One disappearance could be called tragic, but when another followed and then another, it became impossible to deny that something sinister was at work. Parents clutched photographs of their daughters, handing them to police officers who often shrugged. With uncertainty, posters of smiling children appeared on lampposts, walls, and storefronts as communities searched together, yet the fear grew heavier with each passing day, and behind closed doors, a man with calculating eyes and twisted desires watched the panic he had created. Marc Dutroux was not a stranger to crime. He had already walked the line of darkness with past offenses that should have marked him forever in the eyes of justice, but loopholes, leniency, and failure to act allowed him to blend back into society while hiding behind the mask of an ordinary life. He lived in a house that seemed unremarkable from the outside, its exterior blending into the neighborhood, yet beneath its floors and behind reinforced doors he had carved out a secret, a place that defied imagination and mocked the innocence of the world. It was a dungeon built with precision, hidden beneath concrete slabs with heavy metal doors sealed tight and lined to muffle sound, a place no one could discover. Without knowing exactly where to look inside these suffocating walls, young girls were kept against their will, stripped of their freedom, their laughter replaced with sobs that were never heard above the earth. The horror existed just a few feet below, where neighbors walked, drank coffee, and spoke about their daily lives, never suspecting that beneath the ground children were trapped in a hell of silence and fear. The disappearances continued, and the pattern was clear to those who dared admit it. Something was hunting the innocent. Dutroux stalked his victims with care, watching, waiting, striking when no one was near. His eyes were always searching for vulnerability, and when he found it, the nightmare began. He would lure them, sometimes with promises, sometimes with force, and when they were taken, they entered a world from which there seemed no escape. The chambers underground became their reality, cold, dim, and suffocating, each moment stretching into eternity as they hoped for rescue. That would never come, at least not soon enough. Investigators chased leads that dissolved into dead ends. They arrested suspects who turned out innocent. They combed through woods, rivers, and abandoned buildings, but the truth was always closer then. They realized the monster lived among them, and his lair was hidden in plain sight. Dutroux himself played his role with disturbing perfection. He was a man with children of his own, a partner, a family, a figure who could pass unnoticed at the market or on the street. He cultivated this disguise, knowing it kept suspicion away, but his neighbors always felt something odd about him. The way he kept to himself, the way he built strange modifications to his home, the way he seemed to vanish at times. Yet nothing tied him directly to the crimes, and so the whispers remained just whispers, while children continued to disappear. Belgium began to change. Fear seeped into the heart of its cities. Parents refused to let their children walk to school. Alone playgrounds grew emptier as mothers and fathers held tighter to their sons and daughters. Each day brought fresh rumors, and each rumor carried the weight of dread. The authorities, meanwhile, struggled not only with the cases themselves, but with growing pressure from families and communities who demanded answers. Police raids were carried out, including one at Dutroux' very house. They searched but failed to find the underground chambers that lay behind a false wall and beneath reinforced floors. They walked above the hidden cries of the missing, without realizing salvation was only inches away. This single failure sealed the fate of some victims. leaving them to perish in the darkness, their lives extinguished not only by the monster but by the tragic oversight of those who had sworn to protect them in the shadows. Dutroux grew bolder, confident that his fortress could not be discovered. His appetite for control deepened as he refined his methods, constructing traps within his home and ensuring that even if someone stumbled close, the evidence would remain hidden. He manipulated those around him, including accomplices who enabled his cruelty. Whether by fear or greed, they too played their part in the underground horror that was unfolding beneath Belgian soil. The police continued their pursuit, but each time they neared the truth, it slipped away. The nation's patience grew thin, and yet the monster continued his work, each abduction a wound on the soul of a country that would soon erupt in fury when the truth at last emerged. The search for the missing girls grew more desperate with every passing day. The faces of the vanished children were no longer just photographs on lampposts. They were haunting reminders on nightly news broadcasts, their names whispered in classrooms, and their stories retold in hushed voices at family dinners. Parents pleaded before cameras, begging anyone with information to come forward, and the police worked tirelessly, yet hopelessly, chasing fragments of evidence that led nowhere. While behind this storm, Marc Dutroux continued his double life, moving through the streets like any other man, his presence so ordinary it was almost invisible. His disguise was not of masks or costumes, but of routine, a father with children of his own, a neighbor who waved occasionally, a man who fixed his car outside his home. Yet behind that thin veil of normalcy, he was hiding the darkest truth, his underground chamber, where stolen innocence was locked away, the cries of his victims swallowed by concrete and steel. Inside that dungeon, time stood still for those trapped within it. They were deprived of light, deprived of the comfort of voices that could offer hope, deprived of everything that made life human and whole. The air was stale, the walls damp, the silence broken only by the faintest sounds of chains rattling or soft sobs that no one outside could hear. It was a nightmare designed to keep victims alive but broken, a place where days melted into nights without meaning while above ground life carried on. Dutroux fed his own twisted sense of power by moving between two worlds, one where he lived as a father, a partner, a citizen, and another where he ruled as a captor in complete control over the terrified young girls who begged for freedom. The very contrast made his evil sharper than most, for he was able to look society in the eye, knowing that only a few meters away, children were suffering. The police had once raided his house, acting on suspicions tied to his criminal history. Yet even in their search, the dungeon remained undiscovered. It was concealed with such precision that even experienced investigators overlooked it. A soundproof wall disguised the entrance, heavy metal doors shielded any noise, and behind them, staircase descended into hell. This single oversight allowed Dutroux to continue unchallenged, the lives of victims slipping away. Because justice had knocked on the very door of horror, but failed to open it, the mistake would haunt the nation forever. Because each child lost after that search was a reminder of how close salvation had been, only to vanish at the hands of incompetent neighbors. Had long felt uneasy about Dutroux. Some noticed the way he worked late into the night, digging and building in his yard. Others saw his strange behavior, how he spoke with a cold detachment, or moved around with suspicious secrecy. He collected cars, kept guard dogs, and built fences that seemed less about keeping intruders out and more about keeping secrets. And yet none of these signs were enough to force the truth into the open. Dutroux was skilled at presenting a picture of eccentricity rather than criminality. His accomplices, too, played their roles, some driven by fear, others by greed, but all complicit in maintaining the machinery of his terror. They helped him secure victims, transport them, and ensure that the dungeon remained hidden. Their silence a second set of chains for those locked beneath the earth. Families, meanwhile, lived in agony. Every day that passed without answers felt like a wound torn deeper. Protests began to stir as anger against police mounted. Why were there no leads? Why were raids yielding nothing? Why did suspicion point in all directions, but never to the right one? It was a question that soon became more than anger. It became fury. Because as months dragged on, the scale of failure was undeniable. The system designed to protect children seemed powerless, even careless, while the real monster carried on in secret. Untouched by law or conscience, Dutroux himself reveled in the illusion of safety. He moved with arrogance, convinced that no one would ever find what he had created. He drove through towns, blending with traffic. He shopped in stores where posters of missing children hung on walls. He read the newspapers that begged for answers, knowing all along that he was the answer. He was the nightmare they could not touch. This knowledge fueled him. It deepened his confidence and gave him the chilling calmness that kept suspicion away. He was hiding in plain sight, and the world was too blind to see. As weeks turned to months, the tension in Belgium grew unbearable. Streets that once rang with children's laughter became quieter as parents refused to let their little ones out of sight. Schools enforced stricter rules. Playgrounds emptied, and even the most ordinary corners of the country felt unsafe. It was as if the entire nation had fallen under the shadow of an invisible predator, and that predator lived unnoticed among them, feeding on their fear. The cries from underground remained unanswered, but the time was coming when silence would break and voices would finally emerge from the dungeon, voices that would expose the horror Marc Dutroux had hidden so carefully. In 1996, everything began to unravel when two young victims who had endured the torment of Marc Dutroux's underground prison were finally discovered alive. Their survival would become the turning point of the entire case, their testimonies a dagger that pierced through the silence that had cloaked Belgium in fear for years. When they spoke, their words painted pictures too horrifying to imagine, tales of being dragged into a house that seemed ordinary from the outside, only to be locked in darkness below the earth. They described the stench of damp concrete, the suffocating air, the feeling of time standing still as they cried out. In vain, their voices smothered by the weight of steel doors. They told investigators of the monster who played the role of captor-tormentor and twisted provider, the same man who lived only meters above them in comfort, as if their pain was nothing more than a tool for his appetite. The revelation shattered the nation. Belgium had been bracing under the pressure of unsolved disappearances, but now the truth was exposed in its rawest form. Parents, who had long hoped for the return of their children, were confronted with the devastating reality of what had truly happened. Their sorrow turned to outrage as they learned not only of Dutroux's cruelty, but also of the unforgivable failures that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. News spread like wildfire. Newspapers printed graphic accounts, television cameras swarmed neighborhoods, and suddenly the private nightmare of families became a public storm. Protests erupted across Belgium's streets, filled with thousands of citizens who no longer trusted the very system sworn to protect them. People carried banners demanding justice, their chants echoing through cities. Parents marched with photographs of their lost daughters, their grief transforming into anger aimed squarely at the police and courts. The incompetence of the investigation became a national scandal. Families learned that police had searched Dutroux's home and missed the dungeon entirely, that cries for help had been drowned out by neglect, and that bureaucracy had cost lives. It was more than just a crime, it was a betrayal of trust. The anger boiled over into what became known as the White March, a massive protest where hundreds of thousands of Belgians dressed in white filled the streets, demanding change. Their unity symbolized not only grief but defiance against a system that had failed them so completely. Politicians resigned, high-ranking officials faced questions, and for a time, the very foundations of Belgium's institutions trembled under the fury of its people. Meanwhile, the media captured every detail of the unfolding horror. The discovery of the dungeon was documented in chilling photographs, the cold walls, the narrow spaces, the evidence of lives stripped of dignity and joy. Reporters described the chains, the mattresses, the suffocating silence of a place that should never have existed. Society could no longer turn away from the magnitude of Dutroux's crimes. Every revelation felt like another wound inflicted on the conscience of a nation, and still the story was far from over. Dutroux was arrested and brought before the world. Cameras flashed as he was paraded into custody, his expression calm, almost indifferent, as if he knew that his name had already been carved into history. As a symbol of depravity, investigators pieced together his web of crimes, unearthing accomplices who had enabled his actions, either by fear or by choice. Their testimonies revealed that Dutroux's darkness was not his alone, but part of a wider circle of silence and complicity. The details of his methods emerged, slowly, each one more disturbing than the last. How he abducted children, how he manipulated and controlled them, how he meticulously planned his underground chambers to ensure no one could hear the cries from below. The families of victims endured the added agony of waiting for justice as the case wound its way through a slow and tangled legal process. The trial became a spectacle dragged out for years, while emotions burned hotter each passing day. Parents sat in courtrooms, forced to hear the most excruciating details of what had been done to their children, and yet they remained determined to see justice served. Belgium as a whole seemed suspended between grief and fury, waiting for a verdict that could never undo the damage, but might at least close the chapter. On one of its darkest eras, the surviving victims became symbols of resilience. Their words not only condemned Dutroux, but also gave voice to the silenced cries of those who had perished in his grasp. Their courage inspired a movement that went beyond the crimes themselves. It forced an entire nation to look inward, to confront the flaws in its justice system, and to recognize that vigilance against such evil could never again be taken lightly. But as the trial stretched on, Belgium and the watching world wondered if true justice would ever come, if the man who had been branded a monster would finally face the weight of his crimes, or if the endless delays would allow his darkness to linger longer than it ever should. When the trial finally concluded and the verdict was read aloud, the weight of years of pain hung heavy in the courtroom. Marc Dutroux was sentenced to life in prison, a punishment that could never erase what he had done, but at least ensured that he would never again breathe freedom among the society he had terrorized. His name by then was already etched into infamy, whispered with disgust and fury as the Monster of Belgium. The details of his underground chambers, the chains, the cries that went unheard, and the lives stolen had already scarred the nation forever. People across Belgium breathed not with relief, but with exhaustion. The end of the trial was not a triumph. It was a reminder of how much had been lost, and how long justice had taken to arrive. The families of the victims sat in silence, some with tears, others with empty stares. Justice had been served on paper, but no sentence could return the daughters they had buried. No verdict could fill the void left in homes where laughter had once lived. Still they clung to the small measure of closure that came from knowing Dutroux would never harm again. The courtroom echoed with the shuffle of feet and the murmurs of reporters rushing to deliver the news. But for those who had carried photographs of their missing children through marches and protests, this was not just a headline, it was the closing of a wound that would never fully heal. Outside the court, crowds gathered, many wearing white as they had during the great marches of protest years earlier. Their banners spoke of justice. Their chants reminded the government that this case had not only exposed a man's evil but also the failures of a system meant to protect its children. Belgium had been forced to confront the corruption and incompetence that allowed Dutroux to operate unchecked, the police raids that missed the dungeon, the delays in investigations, the whispers that were ignored. All of it had contributed to the suffering and death of innocent children. Reforms were promised, officials swore never again, and institutions were forced to rebuild trust with a public that had been shattered. For the survivors of Dutroux's crimes, life would never return to what it once was. The memories of darkness, chains, and silence remained etched into their minds, yet their courage to testify had changed the course of the story. They had taken the voice that Dutroux tried to steal and used it to expose him to the world. Their bravery ensured that his crimes were not just whispered tragedies, but recorded horrors that would haunt history forever. Their words reminded everyone that even in the darkest of places, voices can rise to bring truth into the light. The dungeon itself became a symbol, a chilling reminder of how evil can hide in plain sight beneath Ordinary houses behind ordinary doors. Some wanted it destroyed to erase its memory. Others wanted it preserved as proof of what had happened, a warning to future generations. About the depths to which human cruelty can sink whatever its fate, the image of those underground rooms would remain in the minds of millions. A place that turned a nation's stomach and shattered its innocence. The trial and its aftermath left Belgium forever changed. The White March had shown the world how ordinary citizens could unite against injustice and demand accountability from their leaders. The case reshaped the nation's justice system, forcing reforms in policing and child protection. It became a warning for other countries as well, that monsters are not only found in the shadows, but sometimes hidden in plain sight. Behind the mask of normal life, Dutroux's story was not only about one man's evil, it was about vigilance, responsibility, and the price of neglect. As the years passed, the name Marc Dutroux continued to stir anger and fear, a reminder that beneath the surface of society, darkness can grow undetected. He lived his life behind prison walls, condemned to die within them, stripped of power, stripped of control, but never stripped of the legacy of pain he created. His name would never be forgotten. In Belgium, it would echo as a warning that evil can be ordinary, that horror can exist just next door, that the true monsters are not only in stories, but sometimes are men who smile, wave, and hide their crimes beneath the ground. And so the story of the Monster of Belgium comes to its end, not with relief, but with remembrance that children lost can never be returned. The scars will never fully fade, but their voices and the voices of their families forced a nation to face its own failures and ensure that no one like Marc Dutroux would ever again be allowed to build a dungeon of horror in silence. His prison cell became his final chamber, the bars his eternal walls, his punishment. Fitting not because it erased his crimes, but because it confined the monster at last, leaving the world outside to remember, grieve, and vow never to let such darkness rise again.